Committee. Sorry about my tardiness. I was down speaking to about 15 of our youth that are here. And so it was a great opportunity to visit with them. I always love it when our youth get involved in this process. So this is great. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with our informational hearing. And we have John Federico, President, Chief Lobbyist, Federico Durst Consulting Group, who's going to do a couple of introductions for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Federico, Federico Durst Consulting. I wanted to start by just saying thank you. We have, I'm thanking the chairman for the opportunity. This is, whenever you can have good, open intellectual debate on thorny issues, I think it does nothing but help the process and the understanding. And as far as the two people that I brought with me to testify, to present on this issue, we hope we accomplish that. The first person that we'll introduce is John Mueller. John is the CEO of Greenlight and partner at Mid-America Capital. He previously served as CEO of Acres Cannabis and Acres Cultivation in Nevada. He returned back to Kansas after selling that business. He is a resident of Leawood, and he brings extensive experience with state regulations and compliance. I think what's most pertinent to know about him is that he runs both a grow facility in Missouri and several retail locations, one very close to the state line. So as we talk about the notion of decriminalization, he perhaps can speak to firsthand experience about being so close to the state line. The second person has a very compelling story. Dante Westmoreland. His story, unfortunately, is not unique. He was one of nearly 40,000 people sentenced to prison for nonviolent cannabis convictions. Dante was arrested and convicted on the charges of possession with intent to distribute marijuana, and with no criminal record and nothing illegal in his possession, he was sentenced to 92 months in jail. He was released in 2020, and then in 2021 was exonerated. But his story gained national attention, and I thought this might be an interesting perspective as we talk about this. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll get out of the way, introduce Mr. Mueller to the podium.
All right. Thank you very much, John. We'll now welcome John Mueller, CEO of Greenlight, to join us.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thanks everyone here. As John mentioned, anytime you can come out and talk about something that's a little bit stickier than other issues, it's a privilege for you guys to take your time and listen. But quick background on me. Currently the CEO and co-founder with my brother, Leawood resident, as he mentioned. We operate 26 dispensaries from West Virginia, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, and South Dakota today, and expanding back to Las Vegas, where I got my start in this. I was an old Reagan on Just Say No person, and then I saw the industry develop as we went on patient visits in California. So we went in and helped stand up the medical program in Nevada. Moved out there for a couple of years, and then I'm happily back here in Leawood. But currently we operate those facilities. I've got 450 people that now work for Greenlight across the country. And I don't know if you guys saw, but 1 out of every 10 jobs was created over in Missouri this last year through the marijuana industry. So I'm kind of the industry guy. But I want to quickly talk about, basically you have 3 of your borders today are surrounded with programs, 2 of which are adult use and also medical as well. And then Oklahoma could be an adult use market. So as we sit here today, there's $2.3 billion being transacted on your 3 borders. And then Nebraska, we think is a little ways off. But if you look at those, the number of people there and the number of Kansas residents are within an hour drive of any one of those sites. I think we have to address the elephant in the room and look at your penal code as many other locations have. Obviously, if you go over to Missouri, you can have 3 ounces and through the constitutional amendment and not get arrested. And then you go to Colorado, you can have 1 ounce. And then all the way in Nebraska without any program whatsoever. We've got 38 states in the country now with some form of marijuana programs, medical and adult use mixed in there. But you go to a place like Nebraska and you look at their penal code versus Kansas, and you can have up to 1 ounce up there, and it's a minor infraction. When here we are in my home state, 6 months and $1,000. And it's very, very scary as you look at one of my operations, which is 135th and State Line, if you know the area, and right across from Leawood, and there's a lot of Kansas plates there. And you look at my other buddy's plates in the west side of Missouri, and there's a lot of Kansas plates there. And you look at right now, and we just spoke in another one about the medical bill that's floating out there. And just so you know, Missouri was the fastest program ever to get up and operational, and that took us 18 months. So as we're talking about decriminalization, don't think that the medical bill will solve that short-term problem for us, because that's years off, and we're talking about hundreds of people being, incarcerated, whether it's jail time for a night or something longer. But I'm asking your discretion. Obviously, this is the first conversation about changing the penal code, and this is going to be a long process. We understand that, but you've got about, last thing I heard is about $800 million in black market that's coming in the country, and obviously on the other side of this equation, we're hoping that that's taxed, regulated, and tested. But in the short term, I think you need to really think about how we allocate our police department's resources. And I just met with Overland Park, not on this subject, but on school safety, and they have 24 open jobs, and they can't, with all the geopolitical stuff going on, they can't find law officers. So I think it's an opportunity for this body to look at what we're chasing, actually, and how do we allocate those resources to fentanyl. It kills 70% of all overdoses in the country. So I think this is where the conversation, I believe, begins, and I appreciate your guys' time.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go ahead and hear from Dante Westmoreland before we go to questions. So, Dante, welcome to the committee.
Hello, Chairman Oman and members of the committee. My name is, as you mentioned, Dante Westmoreland. I was incarcerated in Lansing Correctional Facility for a pound of marijuana. Going out here for college with a couple buddies, traveled from California, entered into that small area where, they kind of focus on people coming in with, drugs. Got pulled over on that I-70 towards Kansas State. Really got pulled over for having dirt on a license plate. Nothing crazy. Told the officer where we're going up to K-State to visit my buddy. Getting down there to the K-State area, they had followed us through. My buddy had brought, some pounds in the car. Eventually went to a jury trial in Manhattan, Kansas, and got found guilty of the pound of marijuana. Just a week, not to keep the story too long, but just a week before, flew out there, getting ready to go to trial. Just buried my grandmother, picked up foster care for my brothers. My lawyer didn't even read my case. So it encouraged me after I lost my jury trial to go read my case. Read it so much. Didn't understand what I was reading. As you guys know, we have the law library inside the prison. Just read it, just kept reading. Found out that the state, withheld evidence that could probably prove my innocence. I filed a motion, kind of like a jailhouse motion, and you see these people in prison, many people in prison, just habitual offenders, and they're in there for marijuana. I got a guy named Antonio White. He's serving 12 years. Been in 5 so far, but just a guy just traveling through Denver on a way to Tennessee. But yeah, like I was saying, just being in prison for this marijuana has just kind of opened my eyes, and really just want to help those people that are incarcerated as well, especially the nonviolent cannabis offenders. And I think a decriminalization bill will really help those people. But just, going through these phases, these people are away from their family. And there's just so many people that are out of state in prison. And I look at the number, $32,000 per person in prison, a year that we spend on these guys. But just overcoming, winning this motion that I didn't think I was going to win. I really tried for the clemency. I wrote, 125 state representatives. I don't know if any of you guys got my letter, and 40 senators a while back, and 4 of them wrote me back. I got out real, they said they were still sending letters back, but I got out real soon afterwards through the courts. The prosecutor did a great thing. He looked inside my motion and agreed that, one of the people on his staff did withhold that evidence. He reversed my conviction, and that prosecutor is a great guy. And we implemented ways, on getting a drug court out there in Raleigh County and just helping those people that are around the cannabis. But I just want to thank you guys today for just kind of telling my story, and really want to help people like myself that may be in there in Antonio. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Dante. Committee, we have questions for Dante or Mr. Mueller. Representative Butler.
Thanks for your testimonies. I'm just curious, what is the penalty for possession of marijuana or THC or anything right now?
6 months and $1,000
Is that,
for the first offense.
we'll tell you what, why don't, Natalie, you want to look that up for us, and we'll get that answer for you, just to be specific, because I know there's different misdemeanor levels and things like that. So Natalie will look that up for us. Additional questions, committee? All right, seeing none, we will now be pleased to hear from Mark Bennett with the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office, who will be joining us on WebEx.
Commissioner Owens, Committee member, let's try this again. Committee Chair Owens, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Sorry. Been a busy day and it's not over yet. I was asked to speak about this. I spoke to a group of legislators in Lindsborg about a year ago, and I was asked to sort of repeat some of the message I'd given at that time. I'm not here to be pro or, offer the pros and cons of marijuana, but it's more of a, if this is something we're going to undertake, there are things to be considered. One of the points I wanted to make is with respect to DUIs. The use of marijuana is already, as people have said, people are already using marijuana. So whether we legalize it, don't legalize it, continue on the course, we're still dealing with it. But just by way of example, the 2022 cases in Sedgwick County tested by our Regional Forensic Science Center, and this is not all of them because they're still testing. It takes some time to complete those tests. But in 30% of the DUIs that were investigated last year in Sedgwick County, THC was involved, was at least part of the blood that was drawn from these DUI potential offenders. I showed a copy of the statute in my written testimony, 81567, and pointed out that when it's alcohol, we know exactly what the state deems to be an illegal amount, 0.08. But we have no such comparison for THC levels. And several states have. Oklahoma, Ohio, Nevada listed as 2 nanograms. Colorado set it at 5, although they call it a permissible inference instead of an amount that is illegal. I guess my point is, if we're going to start talking about ways to address marijuana and whether it becomes legal or at least more accessible in some fashion, we do need to talk about what do we do about people who are driving under the influence of THC, because if something's more available, there'll be more people using it and more people getting in cars and driving. So I've made a suggestion here in the law about some language that if this is going to be taken, take on this sort of a holistic approach, it's something to consider with respect to DUIs. Second point I wanted to make briefly was with respect to marijuana sales, black market sales that lead to violence. This may not be the case everywhere, but in Sedgwick County, it is still quite an issue for us. Between 2018 and 2022, we had 13 separate homicides that occurred in Sedgwick County involving marijuana sales. Not meth, not cocaine, but marijuana sales. If you throw in those other drugs, we've had even more. But the idea is that, well, if we legalize it, that would go down. And I'll get to that here in a moment. But when there is not, when the black market is allowed to be as robust as it is and has continued to be, even in states where legalization has occurred, the incidents of violence that surround those illegal sales continue to plague communities, and obviously that's my big concern here. Two people involved in a hand-to-hand buy that goes without a hitch, I'll be honest with you, I don't care. I mean, fine. But when a gun is drawn, when a gun is involved, that gets my attention because it's violence in our community. And I think anything we do needs to make sure that we don't inadvertently enhance the black market. As to the black market, that was my next point in my written testimony. California is probably the state that has had the most attention, although certainly not the only state where, was it 38, I think I heard or read recently, and I think I may have heard that from an earlier proponent. 38 states have some level of increased access to marijuana. The concern I have is that I think the approach that was taken by the proposition that was passed in California was that, well, let's be reasonable about this. Let's not force this on communities. If a municipality or city wants to opt out, they have that ability. Let's make the licensures to sell marijuana very expensive, and let's at the end of it tax really tax it heavily, and that will be a benefit to the community. And what the California experiment has shown is that I think the number was 80% of municipalities opted out, and so it's not readily available everywhere, which leaves pockets where it's not available through a legitimate source. Number two, the taxes that or the heavy licensure fees meant that fewer people were able to have dispensaries. And then the taxes, apparently what I'm reading is about 50% of the cost associated with marijuana in these places are attributable taxes. So what do people do? It's not, I don't have a dispensary near me. The ones I do have are very expensive. So I'm gonna go to the black market because it's cheaper and more readily available. And as a result, even the marijuana industry in California has said they're thinking 80% of the sales that are occurring there are on the black market. And in fact, one of the articles I plugged in here was some of the legitimate growers who have licenses are saying we're having to sell on the black market to subsidize our legal sales because our legal sales are so over the barrel right at the moment. We're not selling enough because of the proliferation of the black market. So it's a market force issue there. My point is this: what seems like a sort of an enticing approach, which is we can tax this, we can legalize it, it'll reduce violence, it'll reduce costs associated with enforcement, and there will be this tax boon to the community. If a lot of effort is not put into establishing an infrastructure for this to take place, whether it's medical or recreational, you can end up doing, as other states have shown, more harm than good, even to the legitimate business. And then finally, I pointed out the THC levels. I think we've all heard about this, but the levels of THC that are present in products that are sold now have the potential, not always, but have the potential certainly to be much higher than maybe marijuana might have been, years ago. And so we're having folks with exceptionally high levels of marijuana in their system, and that's a whole other issue. But when it comes to enforcement, it's very difficult for law enforcement to test in the moment whether or not something is in fact the level that it's supposed to be. It takes a lab and several months to do that, and so there's an enforcement angle as well. My big picture is this: I think there's sort of an incentive, I suppose. There's the idea of marijuana legalization, or at least decriminalization, for instance, making it only an infraction punishable by a fine, that sort of thing, has a certain appeal to the public. And the idea of increased tax revenue derived from the sales in this arena might have an incentive for legislators or for policymakers. My only point is, before we get into this, I think we need to go slowly and ensure that what we do, if we do anything, is well reasoned and does not enhance the black market, as it looks to me has been almost unequivocally the case in California and several other states. That's not to say it can be done correctly, but I think a rush to this without having put in the work to have established the infrastructure would be the thing I'm most concerned about. The example I've given in my written testimony is perhaps apt, depending on which route someone's talking about, but it's compared often to alcohol. Why should we have alcohol be legal when marijuana, or why should marijuana be illegal if alcohol is legal? Fine. I mean, I'm not here to debate the merits of access to marijuana. I'm here to talk about unintended consequences. And what we've done with respect to alcohol is we, as a state, years ago, made a decision, whether explicitly or implicitly, that we would be complicit and involved in the sale of alcohol. We have liquor stores that are licensed. You have to apply and have a whole litany of restrictions from where you sell it, what times you sell it, who can sell it, who can have the license, etc. We have an ABC agency that goes around and ensures compliance, from bar checks to undercover sales to everything else, to ensure that this is done. We don't just leave it to cops to ensure that the sale of alcohol is done within the limits of the law. We have invested in an infrastructure that allows alcohol to be sold. And my point is, I think a similar level of commitment on the part of the state would be necessary if we want to get into the sale of marijuana. Then I think we have to endorse that as a state, not sort of tepidly step forward, but have to move forward boldly on this. Otherwise, we could do a lot more harm than good. So that is a very quick recitation of what I think is a 5 or 6 page written piece of testimony. Last thing I would point out, to answer the earlier question I heard, what are the levels? When I started my career in Kansas 28, 29 years ago, the first time possession of marijuana was what's called a Class A misdemeanors, 12 months. Back in those days, it was $1,500 fine. We have, a few years ago, amended marijuana, so the first time is now a Class B. We've had a lower level, so that's punishable by 6 months in jail, and I believe the numbers are $1,000 fine. I will say, no one does that. You get probation for that. But it's a Class B. The second possession now, instead of becoming a felony as it used to be, is a Class A. Then the third possession is where we get into the felony level. I didn't really address this because all I understood was just an informational hearing, but there are other options if the legislature ever wanted to address it, to decriminalize. The term decriminalize means many things to different people, but we could make it always a misdemeanor. We could only make it a fine, sort of an infraction. We could, like I said, there's different avenues available, and I'd be happy to offer proposed testimony for that if that's a route that at some point this legislature or next year after that wants to go. So again, my point here was to simply lay out the concerns that I think, that I have at least. I believe many in law enforcement would as well, that we just go slowly and make sure we're going to get the result that we intend by any step that we take. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate you being here. Committee, you have questions for District Attorney Bennett? Representative Carmichael, then Representative Resman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. District Attorney, for being here. I always find your testimony helpful, even on occasions when I don't necessarily agree, and this is one where I think you and I have a great deal of agreement. I would like to ask you a little bit about how marijuana laws are being enforced in Sedgwick County. As I understand it, the city has now stricken its possession of marijuana ordinance. And so under the city law, if you will, or city code, it's no longer against the law to possess marijuana in Wichita. The city used to issue citations and notices to appear on those municipal ordinance infractions. And since it's no longer against the law, they don't issue those anymore. And my understanding is that the only enforcement, other than theoretically DEA and federal enforcement, the only enforcement of marijuana laws in Sedgwick County is now coming through your office. Is that generally correct?
We are the only option in town. That's accurate.
And you all don't have, or sheriff's officers, city police officers, I don't believe have the option of issuing a notice to appear, citation and notice to appear for marijuana infractions. Is that right?
Law requires, we don't, since the state law does not allow for infractions, it's either the misdemeanor or nothing.
Meaning that notices to appear are not issued for marijuana possession in your county?
That's accurate.
So if we're going to enforce the marijuana laws in Sedgwick County as far as simple possession of, say, an ounce or less is concerned, it means that the person has to be arrested, taken to jail, booked into jail, and typically released on their own recognizance. Is that about how that works?
Typically, they could also not arrest and then come and submit a case to us. We could issue an arrest or a summons. I mean, but the bottom line is some mechanism has to be, some long form mechanism, either a summons or a complaint to be issued.
So is your office still prosecuting these cases?
As I told, I was looking quickly here for my numbers. There were, I'll get myself over a barrel if I shoot from the hip here. Yeah, I don't have the numbers from the city, but I did have them at one point. I want to say there were 700 or 1,000 cases a year, something like that from the city, maybe more. I don't have it in front of me. I apologize. And as I said to the city council, though, when they were going to do this, if you expect me to pick this up, you're wrong. And if you think I'm going to, I won't. I don't have the bandwidth to take on 700 or 1,000 more cases a year. We're already at max capacity handling murders and rapes and things like that. So the vast majority of these cases are not being prosecuted. And you can conclude from that what you will, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing. But I have to make certain decisions and prioritizing in a time when we have over the course of the last 3 years, now last year not so bad, but the 3 years preceding, we had record numbers of homicides. So to answer your question, no, we're not all of these.
Yeah, and Mr. District Attorney, please understand, I have no criticism of your use of prosecutorial discretion in that regard. There's other questions I might have, but we better give our colleagues an opportunity to inquire.
Thank you. Representative Resman.
Mr. Chairman, my question is for Mr. Bennett. And I don't know if he can answer this question or not, but in the black market sales, is California doing anything to prevent those from happening, or is it just going to be that they're happening and the state's just doing the best they can?
Legislature ever intended this, or that they are turning a blind eye to it. I think it's a matter of enforcement. You've got a state that large with that many that many people living there, and law enforcement stretched to handle all sorts of other crimes. I think they're doing what they can do. So I don't believe that this was an intended consequence. I think it was an unintended consequence, which is really my point here. I don't think anyone sets out to enhance. Any legislator in the United States is going to set it to enhance the black market. My point, though, is I think that they made certain decisions that were more politically feasible, i.e., we're not going to force it on all jurisdictions. If you don't want it, you don't have to have it. We're going to make it very expensive. We're going to tax a ton of it. And we're going to, all of these things sound very attractive. The problem is the unintended consequence of that is no one can afford to go, not no one, but very few people can afford to go buy this expensive marijuana. I mean, I've made this, it sounds flip and I don't mean it to be, but there's a lot of folks who drink Natty Light, okay? At the liquor store, they want cheap, they want to have that. Not everybody wants a $20 6-pack of craft beer. A lot of folks want a $12 30-pack. And when these dispensaries are selling stuff at a 50% markup in taxes, you've driven the black market up. When you can go around the corner and buy a lot less or a lot more for a lot less, that's what you're looking at. And that's my point.
Go ahead. All right, committee additional questions, preferably not about Natty Light. Go ahead, Representative Carmichael.
Thank you. And for the record, I don't like Natty Light.
Okay.
Just make it clear.
No.
Okay. Mr. District Attorney, I think what you're really telling us is that we need to be careful. If we should legalize, regulate, and tax marijuana, we need to be careful about how much money we take out of the marketplace for the state, because the more you take out, the more likely it is that you will still have a proliferating black market in marijuana. Is that generally what you're explaining to me?
Generally speaking, my big picture is the black market is a bad thing. It carries violence, et cetera. And I just want to make sure that anything we do does not inadvertently, unintentionally add to that problem.
And that's part of why I appreciate you being here so much today, Mr. District Attorney. I think it's a good point. If we look at and analogize with alcohol, where we did legalize alcohol, we
developed a fairly extensive system of regulation of alcohol, and of course we tax it as well. Do you see a proliferating black market in alcohol in Wichita? And if you do, is that accompanied by the same type of gun violence that you see in what is now an exclusively black market in marijuana?
No, and I think that's for two reasons. One is because, as you said, we have an infrastructure built in that alcohol is readily accessible and relatively cheap for people who want it, number one. Number two, there's not a lot of people brewing Bud Light in their garages, or I'll say it again, Natty Light. Sorry, Steve. But the difference here in marijuana is one that is a tangible difference, and that is you can grow it in your basement, garage, etc., and so which is harder to do with alcohol. But again, I think that can be overcome if the state is serious about what it's doing here. Again, I think I'm beating the same ground here, but it's just, I don't think it's as easy as I've heard it discussed. I think it's a far more difficult endeavor and one that takes a deep commitment on the part of the state.
And I don't disagree at all. One thing I would observe, though, finally, is that marijuana is a fungible product. If you have a bag of marijuana, you can't tell whether it was purchased from a legitimate dispensary or whether it was purchased on the black market. But Natty Light typically does come in a can that says it's been through the process of regulation and taxation. I think that's one of the problems with developing inadvertently a black market in marijuana is how do you distinguish the black market product from the licensed and regulated product? Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Certainly. Mark, quick question for you from my perspective.
Sure.
And I don't want this to sound like I'm either a proponent or an opponent to legalization, but would your argument be that you would prefer well-regulated legalization over decriminalization?
I think there are two different answers. I think two different situations. If you decriminalize, that's fine. It doesn't address how people get it, and it would not lead to fewer, I don't think it would really lead to fewer, a lower level of violence for this reason. I'm still doing something that's illicit. I'm still pulling up and either bringing money or bringing marijuana to a deal that is an illicit deal. It's outside of the law. And I'm going to risk that the guy on the other side of the contract at the exchange is there in good faith and doesn't have a gun and is going to rob me of my money or my marijuana. So we could decriminalize, but without a mechanism to get it legally and safely into the hands of people, you're not going to end the violence. As to the other, legalizing it and having this infrastructure, that would, I have yet to see a place where that has worked to the exclusion that has eliminated the illicit market. But I'm pointing out that there would be steps that one could take to at least lower the risk, I should say. So.
Fair enough. Thank you. Representative Mon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question is really for any of the conferees and for the opponents, if you can think about it and maybe address it as well. I'm not really have too much heartburn one way or another on what we do with marijuana, but in other hearings we've heard a lot of discussion about fentanyl making its way into all sorts of drugs and even lacing even leafy marijuana. And recently I've saw a story about fentanyl even showing up in legalized marijuana products. And if anyone knows, I would like to know if we have any information about, and I know the fentanyl epidemic is really a fairly new phenomenon, so we may not have this, but does anyone have any information about how legalization maybe impacts the fentanyl problem? And if we don't know, that's fine. It's just obviously a concern that I'm more concerned about the fentanyl issue right now than I am about the effects of marijuana.
Well, John Mueller, again, thank you for the question. And the short answer is we don't, because anything coming through the black market is not going through, something you buy in the state of Missouri is tested for 54 different things where your water is tested for 4. So anything coming out of a legal, regulated location, like in the state of Missouri across the border here, is 100% sure it doesn't. You look for mold, heavy metals, aspergillus, et cetera. I can list all 54 here, but I think that's the key, and I think to the district attorney's point, like, if, he's basically skirting around what the penal code is coming out of Topeka here, and I think, doing it properly, obviously, if everybody was treating it the same as Wichita, I don't think we would be here having the conversation, so my compliments to him.
Follow-up, Representative Mon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, one of the concerns, obviously, the attractiveness of the black market once we have a legal market would be, hey, I can give you much more potent marijuana. And so my concern is, do we then, the unintended consequence of the black market marijuana being laced with all sorts of other things to increase the potency? I don't want this to sound like I'm really an opponent. This is not something I advocate for or against. I don't know. I need to learn more about where it's going and how we would proceed or not proceed. But these are just concerns that I have. And Mark, if you have any insight from looking across the country at what's going on in other states, I'd appreciate your input. But as I said, anyone who thinks they know something about this, I'd appreciate the input.
The only thing else I'd add is that with respect to the legalization in other states, I will say that Colorado, we have said for a long time, since Colorado legalized or took its action, that we've had primarily Colorado marijuana in our area. That, to be clear though, it's not dispensary marijuana, and I know it's hard to tell that, but you only buy a certain amount per day, and we have people who leave on a Friday and come back on a Sunday, and they've got pounds of it in their back of their car. They didn't buy that legally in marijuana or in Colorado, excuse me. It's that the black market is still prospering in Colorado, and so I'm looking. Again, the proponents and opponents can spend an afternoon telling you why it's good and bad. I'm trying to cut through no pun intended. I'm trying to cut through the fog here and say let's talk about the pragmatic points of view. If you're really going to do this, what would it look like? And the thing I am concerned about is how to find a state, find an example where they've done this and they've done so in such a fashion that it is safer and it has eliminated the black market. And I do not. This is not where I spend my time. I've got opinions on it, but I'm not an expert in this. I've just done some research, but I'm sure there's somebody who has devoted a lot more time to this that can maybe answer that. But to date, I've not found a place that's found that magic combination of public policy and market research that has figured out a way to do both.
Thank you. Representative Schlangensieben.
This question is for John Mueller, I think, or anyone who wants to answer it. We were talking earlier about how you would determine the limits of THC when it comes to being incapacitated as a driver, for example, might be. With all the different products that are out there in places where it is legal, is there such a thing as Bud's Light? Pun intended. Is there such a thing as I mean, are there ways, I mean, I assume there are ways to sort of classify the levels of THC in various products so that you do have like the equivalent of, say, a light beer versus a...
Yeah, I think you can look, I mean, we have patches, all kinds of other stuff, and the transmission of that is much different. And then the gummy is the #1 seller in the state of Missouri across the border here. And we have everything from 5 milligrams to 50 milligrams. We say a dose is 10 milligrams, generally speaking. We have people bite them in half, just eat a little quarter of it. But the challenge is when you start talking about like how much THC, like so in what we would advocate for in the state of Kansas too, is the number of milligrams of THC that somebody can purchase on a monthly basis should be regulated and controlled, because what you're trying to do, to his point, is kill the black market. So in Missouri, and I think those studies will come, we still have an eighth at $20, which an eighth is 3.5 grams. That goes in a jar. It's tested for the 54 different things we talked about. That's what kills the black market. And to your point is the place like California where they overtax it, or Illinois. Those people are now coming over because the tax rate's less and there's more cultivators. But then you also look, and it's a happy medium, because you look at Oklahoma, and you know, it'll be my dead body if I let my home state look like Oklahoma, because there's more black market coming out of Oklahoma than anywhere else because they let out 20,000 cultivators. And there's no way for these regulators, your ABC here, which is in the current bill, to even think about going to regulate that, or the 2,900 dispensaries that have been licensed, and you shut your doors, you move down the street, you sell a bunch of black market, and you keep on moving down there. And the problem with California, to his point, is they had 2 decades that they tried to put the genie back in the bottle. And so up in NorCal and all those places where all the black market used to come out of, you know, basically it morphed into, now for the Midwest, Oklahoma produces a lot more. It's no longer coming from Mexico because there's no math in it. You know, at the end of the day, you kill the cartels and all these other places when there's no math. But I can assure you, like, coming out of a licensed dispensary in the state of Missouri or I don't know about Colorado, but definitely out of Oklahoma, there's some nefarious things going on. But when the licenses have value and they're highly controlled, and I know from where that state knows what corner of the building I was growing that plant in to who was the person that purchased it on the other end, and they call me when I'm off by a gram on my inventory. That's the type of program we're talking about here. Obviously, this is a penal code deal, but and I hope we all do Wichita. So if we could listen to him and do the penal code so these guys don't have to, I think would be the short answer. But if you take 2 gummies, I think that's the same equivalent of having that 1 gummy with 50% the value. So how do you stop someone from taking 2, to answer your original question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So are there any estimates of what the cost would be to regulate marijuana similarly to
Well, we're focused in here on a decriminalization conversation. The legalization, I think, is happening in kind of another room. The conversation we wanted to have in here is the benefits and drawbacks of just decriminalizing it as a whole. So we'll go ahead now and we'll hear from Ed Klump, who is set up to testify, and I'm sure that will spur a few more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ed Klump, here on behalf of the Kansas Sheriff's Association, Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, Kansas Peace Officers Association. Got that out in one breath again. And not surprisingly, this discussion on decriminalization has morphed into a question of legalization. And I think that's an important point that you all have made by doing that. There's a thin line between decriminalization and legalization. And decriminalization is a very generalized term. There's all kinds of decriminalization. If you just look at the word, you think decriminalize means no longer a crime. But that's not what decriminalization in this arena tends to be. It tends to be reducing crimes and how do you classify crimes. And so my testimony is on decriminalization and not legalization. I spent this morning giving testimony on that issue. I do want to, before I start my testimony, I do want to speak to one thing. One of the previous speakers talked about saving law enforcement resources. I don't think decriminalization is going to save any law enforcement resources. We don't spend a lot of resources on enforcing personal possession of marijuana anymore. Usually it's things we run across in car stops and other things that we're doing. If there was anything that would save resources, it would be to change the law to allow notice to appears in district court for personal possession of marijuana. That'd probably be the one thing that could save law enforcement resources. So our associations, I'm going to say, are opposed to the decriminalization simply because decriminalization in general is such a broad spectrum of what that can mean. I think there are certainly reductions in sentencing and classifications that could be found acceptable by our associations. But overall, when we talk about decriminalization, it would be hard to get generally in support of that without seeing a specific bill and exactly what is being proposed. We also believe there's a lot of misinformation surrounding this involving how many people are being charged with and ending up in jail and prison in Kansas for possession of marijuana, simple possession of marijuana, personal possession, whatever you want to call it. Possession of enough marijuana that it doesn't reach that level where it's presumptive distribution. And so I did a little research on that. There's been numbers put out. I've heard numbers put out in committee on that from some of our state agencies. I think they're very unclear. Here's the data from January 15th in our prison system. There are 73 prisoners in our prison system that are there from a marijuana violation, okay? 70 of those are there for distributing marijuana, not for the mere possession of it. So 70 out of the 73 are there for distributing marijuana. 3 of those are there for possession of drug paraphernalia. And the speculation is those are probably all plea bargains, where they reduced some other charge down to a possession of paraphernalia charge. We don't have hard data on that to say that for sure. Bottom line is 73 people in the state prison system, none of them, 0, are there for simple possession of marijuana. And that 73 represents 0.8% of all the prison population. So we're talking about a very small percentage even there on any kind of marijuana charge and 0 on simple possession. So next I turn to our sheriffs and I ask them, do you have anybody in your jail right now for simple possession of marijuana? Not one in the state of Kansas right now. And most of them added some other things in their response, and they told me that they don't even literally book them in beyond booking them in long enough to get a OR bond signed and get them out of the jail. Even when they're arrested and brought to the jail, they don't stay in the jail. They probably never see the inside of a jail cell. They see the booking room and they're gone. So I just want to point that out. The other thing about that is, let's talk a little bit about the paraphernalia charge. The paraphernalia charge, for the paraphernalia charge to be a felony, the only way and that's the only way it can be a prison sentence, right, is to be a felony. The paraphernalia would have to have been used to cultivate, plant, propagate, harvest, test, analyze, or distribute marijuana. So it's not that we catch you with the pipe to smoke the marijuana in or something like that. That is a personal use paraphernalia, and that is always a misdemeanor. It never escalates to a felony. So nobody's going to go to prison for that. But in addition to using that to be a felony, in addition to using it for those purposes I listed, you would also have to have 2 prior convictions of a person felony to go to prison, because that crime is a severity level 5 drug crime. And before you get to the presumptive imprisonment, you have to have 2 priors of a person felony before you'd ever go to prison on that. So even those that are convicted in court, not a plea bargain, but convicted of that particular crime, it'd be very difficult for them to end up in prison. On the possession of marijuana, and I know the revisor's looking up those penalties, and I'm not gonna take her thunder away, but simple possession of marijuana, the only way it becomes a felony is to have 2 prior convictions of possession of marijuana, simple possession of marijuana. So to go to prison for simple possession of marijuana, you would have to have 3 convictions of possession of marijuana before that could happen. So the first conviction, I think Mr. Bennett alluded to this, first conviction's a B misdemeanor, second conviction's an A misdemeanor, third rises to that level of a low-level felony. And so that's the way that would work. The other thing that I'd like to point about decriminalization, and this would happen if the decriminalization was in a way where it just wasn't a crime anymore. And I don't think that's probably where we would head, but if that were to be the case, many of our drug cases on harder drugs start out with a stop, we spot marijuana, marijuana's illegal, we search further, and now we find not only more marijuana, but we also find cocaine and heroin and meth and all those things that are commonly laced with fentanyl today. And so in that chain of events, if you say that simple possession is no longer a crime at all, then that search would never take place and would never find those other drugs. So that's a kind of an unintentional impact that you want to consider. And lastly, as we research what other states have done, what we found in that data is there are only 2 states that have done what they call decriminalization of marijuana that have not legalized marijuana in some fashion, either medically or recreationally. So one of those states, what they did is they made it an infraction. The first conviction's an infraction with a $200 fine, no jail time possible at all. So $200 fine, no jail. And the other one does a $200 fine with no jail as a misdemeanor, but it's what in our state would be an unclassified misdemeanor with an established fine limit and no jail time possible. So those are the only two states that have done it. In both of those states, it's still a crime. An infraction is still a crime. So it addresses that previous thing I talked about. So there's different ways to do this. There's probably ways that it could be done that our associations wouldn't oppose it, but we'd have to see bills to say one way or the other on that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
Very good. Thank you, Ed. Committee questions for Ed. Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Clump. Good to see you, as always. I guess just a general comment to echo what you said. It's interesting just for some perspective, on the House floor today, we're still unraveling pieces of prohibition in this state from alcohol. I mean, it's built into the system, and I'm not speaking good or bad. You can look at my vote on that, but it's just interesting. We put these systems in place with decriminalization, legalization, and then, how long do they, basically, the minute they go in, people want them reduced. And we're still fighting that on liquor to this day. But you may not be the exact right person for this question, but in that vein, we maybe are missing a public health piece of this, but it starts with the decriminalization conversation, because I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is these substances and marijuana and however you take it, the THC, can have some pretty negative consequences on young people. Not necessarily addiction, but in development. And my concern when you go down decriminalization, you create a cultural acceptance of these substances. And if any of the opponents would like to talk to that. But that's my bigger concern, is basically signaling to young people who are the most vulnerable that this is an okay thing because mom and dad are doing it at home.
And I agree with you on that concern. The Senate Fed and State Committee the last 2 days has had hearings, informational hearings on what's happening in other states with legalization and the impacts that's had. It's been very interesting. There's certainly medical implications. There are people that are much more qualified than are any of the speakers today that can speak to that from a medical field, that are medical experts. But there was a great deal of testimony given today in that committee about that very thing. I think when we talk about desensitizing people to this issue, you go right back to what we call it. And our main objection to medical marijuana is you call it medicine, but you don't treat it like medicine. And so now all of a sudden marijuana is just medicine, so what's the big deal? And then you go to the term recreational medicine or marijuana. So well, nothing wrong with having recreation, right? We all want to have fun. So we put these labels on it that kind of desensitizes us to it from the beginning. And that is unhealthy from the aspect. There's a lot of information on what's happened in other states regarding medical issues involving children and other things, but I think that's another day, another topic, and some better experts at that than are in this room right now.
Further questions? Representative Heiberger.
Yeah, I just want to go back to your remark on medical marijuana. I mean, assuming that you accept that there is medical use of marijuana, I mean, there are other substances that are used in medicine that are abused and abused illegally. Is that not correct?
Other medications that are abused?
Abused and...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And law enforcement has found a way to deal with those things.
Well, I don't know if we have found a way to deal with them. We deal with them the best we can, but they're still out there. They still happen, and then we still have deaths occur because of abuse of drugs. I mean, a lot of suicides are drug overdoses.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Klump. You know, we've come a long ways in 9 years that I've been here on this issue. I want to address concerns about recreational marijuana. When I attended the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Law's Rocky Mountain High seminar in Aspen a couple of years ago for continuing legal education, they were teaching us to not refer to marijuana as being recreational, but rather to use the phrase adult use marijuana. Would that be of any assistance in resolving some of your concern about recreational as opposed to adult use?
The only labeling we're really concerned with is the labeling that goes on products that get sold. You know, what label we put on it as we talk is another issue, but it certainly goes a long way towards the desensitizing people to, you know, the real issues. That shift of calling it recreational or adult use is something that is just turning the corner right now, I think. But you go to a lot of the literature, you go to a lot of the bills across the country, recreational is often referred to.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And there's even some who refer to it as hallucinogenic marijuana.
You know, it's like we don't really look at the title of the bill and decide whether we like it or not. We look at the details of the bill and what it does and what it doesn't do. And that's where we would always go to.
Well, let me turn then to something more specific, realizing we don't have a bill in front of us right now. I can certainly understand your concerns with quote unquote just legalization of marijuana. I might argue, based on the testimony of District Attorney Bennett, that we've pretty much done that in my town now for simple possession because there's no effective prosecution going on for simple possession of marijuana. I have a friend of mine who's literally smoked it on their front porch in the afternoon and nothing happens. That concerns me a little bit because of respect for law enforcement, respect for laws, respect for the rule of law. Are we hurting ourselves by having come to the point now where there really is no effective prosecution for possession of marijuana in my county and lots of other places? Does that breed disrespect for the law, disrespect for law enforcement, contempt for the law? And if that be the case, should we perhaps look at legalization, regulation, and taxation of marijuana instead?
Well, first of all, I don't know of any you know, you often ask me about data on stuff. I don't know of any data that says there's a correlation between that and disrespect for the law. I mean, you could look at it and say, yeah, there probably is, but to what level, who knows?
I agree, it's philosophical, probably, or rhetorical.
So I couldn't answer that part of it. But you know, there's a lot of laws that don't get enforced, and we keep them on the books because they're there for a very important reason in rare cases. And I don't think that causes that problem to any great degree, and I don't think we should take them off the books because they're not prosecuted. Everybody throughout the criminal justice system is taxed by more workload than we can handle. It starts with the law enforcement officer on up through the prosecutor and the courts. And we all have to prioritize where we put our resources and what we do. You know, are we going to open a full-blown investigation because somebody calls in and says your neighbor's sitting on the front porch and smoking dope? By the way, I'm not asking for their address or what time they do that.
1475 is mine, Ed. Stop by anytime you like.
But you know, we don't have the investigative resources to do that. Now, if we come across somebody that's possessing marijuana out in public because of another stop, you know, rarely do we see somebody using marijuana out in public to the point where we stop them and take an action on it. It's usually when we stumble across it while we're doing other enforcement action. And are we going to take steps there? Most likely. I mean, when Wichita did have an ordinance, 750 to 1,000, whatever that number actually is, you know, the times that did happen where there's an enforcement action taken. Is it good or bad that it's not there? I don't know. That's a political decision cities and counties have to make. It's a decision that prosecutors have to make with their resources, depending on what their caseload is. And what I heard from Mr. Bennett was that right now with the caseload they have on homicide, serious crimes, rapes, all those other things, he doesn't have the staff to deal with this level of a crime, a B misdemeanor essentially. And I think that's a reasonable approach for somebody to take with your resources.
I'm sure, Representative, you're inviting him over for a natty light, right? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, I do not drink Natty Light, except when extremely desperate, nor do I smoke ditchweed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, committee. Any further questions today? All right, thank you,
Mr.
Ed.
Chairman Committee.
All right, everyone, thanks for being here. Thanks for having the conversation. It'll be a conversation that I'm sure will be ongoing for some time to come. So with that, we'll close that informational hearing. There's no meeting tomorrow and no meeting on Monday. So enjoy a long weekend, and we'll see you guys back here on Tuesday. We're adjourned.